Hello everyone, and welcome to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad and the Chicago and Northwestern Railway in Wyoming Building Casper series. I'm Mark Pruitt. Pardon the noise behind me. I'm standing next to Casper Yard today, and the switch crew is busy moving cars around the yard. Way back at the end of episode 7, construction part 3 of the series, I said the next construction episode would cover wiring the yard, moving the yard from New Jersey to Wyoming, and also include a bit about enhancements I made to the yard once it was reassembled in Wyoming. Now, only 16 months later, it's finally here. When I first started building Casper Yard, the wiring was very simple. A couple of alligator clips connected to my NCE DCC system to the rails at the end of the main line. This worked just fine until I had more than just one track. Then I had a problem. My Fast Trax turnouts are not power routing. That meant I had to install track feeders. Here's a few after the track was painted. As you can see, they're visible but not obtrusive. When I started installing track feeders, I needed a power bus and distribution system to get power to the feeders. Here's the very beginning of that system. I use standard barrier strips to connect feeders to the power bus. The bus itself is 12-gauge stranded wire, and the feeders are 24-gauge solid wires with installation color that matches the bus wire colors of green and red. With the power bus installed, I very quickly moved away from the alligator clips on the rails power connection. I opted for a much improved DCC station on paint can solution with the alligator clips now connected to the bus wires. It stayed that way until I moved the layout to Wyoming. Here's what the bus and a distribution point looks like under the middle of the classification yard. I was in the midst of hooking up the feeders when I took this shot. I run the bus wires as neatly as possible, but the feeders just run as straight as possible from the hole in the subroad bed to the barrier strip. This shot under the Casper turntable shows how tangled the feeders can get. Here I was reinstalling the feeders to the barrier strips after reassembling Casper in its new home in Wyoming. Once everything was connected, it looked a little better, but not much. Here's the power feeders and bus in the middle of the classification tracks. Not real neat, but the color coding will make it easy to trace wires, and the barrier strips make it almost as easy to disconnect feeders to isolate a short should one occur. You'll recall that my DCC system set on a paint can and was tied into the layout with alligator clips when the layout was in New Jersey. I wasn't going to do that again. Once I began setting up Casper Yard in Casper, one of the first things I did was build some small shelves for the system underneath the Casper benchwork. These are obviously a lot beefier than they need to be. They're made of 2x6 framing lumber. I had a scrap 2x6 sitting around from finishing the train room, so rather than discard it, I made shelves with it. As you can see, there's plenty of room for other components as the layout grows. At this point, the entire layout, including Casper Yard and engine terminal, are fully powered all the time. My 5-amp NCE Power Pro system has no problem starting up with 13 locos on the layout, and 9 of them have sound decoders. I must be getting pretty near the limit for all those sound locos to be starting up at once, but so far there's been no issue. When it does become a problem, I'll add off switches to the roundhouse tracks and mount them on the fascia. That's it for power and control wiring, but there's also the throttle bus wiring and the layout lighting circuits to talk about. Focusing on the throttle bus, even though I have a wireless DCC system, I wanted plenty of connection points to plug in throttles. I installed 2 throttle connection points, or UTPs in NCE parlance, at Casper. One is near the engine terminal, and the other is near the opposite end of the yard. As you can see in this shot of Casper Yard when the layout was in New Jersey, the UTPs were temporarily mounted on the benchwork. When I finally added fascia to Casper, the UTPs were remounted there. The throttle bus wiring started out as anything but tidy. Years ago at a train show, I bought a whole load of throttle bus cables. Since these weren't made to custom fit my UTP locations, I had a lot of extra length on most of them. As you can see here, I simply wrapped the excess length around the nearest benchwork. Early this year, I rerun all my throttle bus wires. There were two reasons I did this. I ran out of the pre-made ones I'd bought years ago, and I was thoroughly sick of the nest of tangled up cables I'd already installed. I bought a 250-foot roll of 6-conductor flat cable and a pack of RJ12 connectors and began making my own custom-length throttle cables. This made for much neater cabling under the layout. There's one more set of wires under Casper for structure lighting, or at least there will be. Right now, only 2 structures are lit, the Roundhouse and Rocky Mountain Drilling. These 2 structures are at opposite ends of the yard, so for now they have 2 independent power supplies for the lights. The Roundhouse is powered by a very old Varney power pack, and Rocky Mountain Drilling is powered by an MRC Tech 2 power pack. Both are way overkill for the lights, but I had them on hand and they weren't being used for anything else, so... Over time, many more structures will be lit, including the entire icing platform and the standard oil loading racks. When I start adding lights to those, I'll be adding a 12-volt DC power bus to feed power to all the structures needing it. It won't be soon. Too much work to do on other parts of the layout. So much for wiring. Let's talk a bit about how I moved the yard from Merchantville, New Jersey to Casper, Wyoming without destroying it in the process. When I built the yard, I did it on 3 grid sections that were mounted on L-girder bases. I got some comments that this was redundant. I didn't need the long side stringers with L-girder construction. The reason I used the side stringers was because I was using 3/4 inch plywood for my benchwork, except for the L-girders themselves and the legs. In normal L-girder benchwork construction, screws are driven through the flange of the L-girder into the edge of the joists. With plywood joists, this would put the screw into the edge of the plywood, which would result in a very weak connection. So I used side stringers and 2x2 blocks to make sure the screws all had something solid to bite into. Turned out later, this was a godsend. Casper was built on 3 different grid sections, each 8 feet long. When it came time to move, it was an easy job to separate the sections and remove them from the L-girders. I simply removed short sections of track where they crossed section boundaries, removed the 2x2 cleats that attached the grid sections to the L-girders, and after cutting power wires, simply lifted the sections off the L-girders. I attached the 2 sections of the classification yard together face to face. The grids made a strong, protective enclosure for the yard tracks. The engine facility had nothing to protect it, but it was placed on top of everything else in the truck and made the trip to Casper without major damage. The L-girders for the entire layout, along with the rest of the benchwork, was disassembled to varying degrees and moved to the new house for reuse. With the exception of the L-girders under the rest of the layout in New Jersey, it has nearly all been reused on the layout in Casper. Those remaining L-girders will be offered for sale at an upcoming train show. With the price of dimensional lumber these days, they have some value, so I'm sure someone will want them. Once unloaded at the new house in Casper, the yard and the benchwork were placed in the basement to await reassembly after the basement was finished. In June of 2020, once basement work was mostly complete, I began reassembly of Casper Yard. Thanks to the way I had constructed the yard initially, it took only a couple of days to have the L-girder framework reassembled and the yard once again mounted. With the sections of the yard once again in place, work could start on reintegrating them together. At the end of June, the tracks had yet to be reinstalled at the section interfaces. Installing new track at the section interfaces, plus rewiring everything, took only about 2 weeks. With somewhere between 20 and 40 hours of work, Casper Yard was once again functional. By moving the yard across country rather than dismantling it completely, I saved hundreds of hours of rebuilding time. But the new space was different than the old, meaning I had some rework to do to Casper to make it better fit the new layout plan. That meant opportunities to add additional industries to Casper where I didn't have room before. I talked about the industries I was able to add to Casper in some detail in Building Casper Episode 3, so I'll only briefly mention them here. When I reworked the main line westbound out of Casper so that it didn't loop back behind Casper as it had done before, I opened up space for 6 small industries. Those included Rocky Mountain Drilling, the Team Track, Natrona Transfer, Storage and Fuel, Schultz Walter Company Grocers, Natrona Lumber, and Wyoming Concrete Producers. Combined with the icing platform and Standard Oil loading racks, Casper has proved, in the early operating sessions I've held, to be a handful for 2 operators, 1 yardmaster, whose job it is to make up and break up trains in Casper and supervise all Casper operations, and 1 full-time local industry switch job. As more of the layout comes online and additional through trains are added to the operations, a 3rd full-time operator, whose job it will be to handle the engine terminal and change out motive power on the trains, will be warranted. I've identified several changes to the yard that will simplify some switching moves, including moving the caboose track from the far end of the yard to a spot off the runaround track, and lengthening the AD track by extending it a bit around the curve towards Douglas. Those changes will be incorporated sometime in the next few months. Overall, I'm very pleased with how Casper Yard is working out. It's a hotbed of activity, just as I'd hoped. But with the layout operational changes I talked about in my last update video, number 37, it's not a hopeless bottleneck either. It will keep 2 or 3 people enjoyably busy during an entire operating session. There may be a few more episodes of Building Casper as I make the track work changes I've mentioned and finish structures and scenery. Or this may be the last episode in the series, with Casper changes and detailing simply covered in the monthly update videos. Time will tell. Meanwhile, thanks for joining me. Stay healthy, stay safe, have fun, and keep on railroading. And have a very Merry Christmas also. See you soon!